Well, today we're having a discussion, just like Kay said, on Emily Dickinson. Now, here's the fun part. Emily Dickinson is largely considered to be one of America's premier poets. And this is a little bit strange because America's, America's poetic tradition is usually occupied by men. So Emily Dickinson's poetry is very strange and it is feminine. And so it might interest those of you looking for something new with a female angle. Okay. Now, just because Emily Dickinson's poems are feminine does not mean they are tame, and it does not mean they are boring. When I was young, I actually didn't like Emily Dickinson very much because I thought she was too simple. Her poems present themselves as deceptively simple. When you look at the poems, you know all the words. However, the meaning can be rather confusing. So I'm going to talk about that with you today. So this is the way I would like our class to go. I would like to give you a brief introduction. Then I will read a bunch of poems with you, I hope. Then I will show you how to compile these into a comprehensive thesis. And then at the end, we will have time for questions and answers. Fun. Let's start talking about Emily Dickinson. Now, I realize the photograph of Emily Dickinson is rather blurry. This can be explained. We only have 2 pictures of Emily Dickinson. That's it. 2. This is one of them. All right, let's start. It says, Emily Dickinson was born in Massachusetts. Now, this is important for the time period. Massachusetts is in the far north of the United States. And at the time, it was associated with wealth, prosperity. Emily Dickinson is a young white woman in a relatively comfortable setting. So this will become more interesting as you see some of the strangeness of her poetry. Right, her family was actually very well known for political activity. And she actually went to school. So she was not ignorant. She was well educated. However, she came home due to homesickness. Okay. Emily Dickinson's life was plagued with a nervous disorder. We don't know what it was, but it was probably high blood pressure and severe nerves. Let's look at later in life. She almost never left the house. Now, children would describe Dickinson as an arm coming out of the window and throwing coins or lowering fruit. So she reminds me a little bit of the creature in the Lorax. Okay. It says, we don't know why she did this. There's actually a show about Emily Dickinson on television right now. And the show itself presents Emily Dickinson as this lost woman in love. We do not know any of this, however. This is all speculation on the television show. We have very little evidence about Dickinson's life, and that makes her poetry even more strange to us. Some people think she was disappointed in love. Some people think it was because of the death of her father. Okay. One theme that shows up in several Dickinson poems is the idea that love is beautiful, but it will be taken away. The idea of lost love, okay? This idea that Emily Dickinson was disappointed. Now, if you research Dickinson on your own or see the television show, again, many, many misconceptions about Dickinson. And honestly, most of them are just made up. Yes, some people think it was a man named Reverend Charles Wadsworth. Okay, when in reality, we have no clue. See? They believe that she was participating in a love affair. Here's the interesting part for me. By the looks of Emily Dickinson's poetry, if we examine it, we realize that even though she was a 19th century woman, there was still a place to doubt God and to doubt religion. Okay? Emily Dickinson was not baptized in her church. Okay? And she believed that preachers had no authority over her. This is a surprise to some readers because 19th century America was often a very religious, specifically Christian place. Okay? So this provides context for you. And it emphasizes just how strange her poetry can be. Here are a few quotes. At 15, she said, "I never enjoyed such perfect peace and happiness." So she was never happy. She also wrote to a friend, "As the short time in which I felt I had found my Savior, I feel I shall never be happy without I love Christ." Later, she said, "Christ is calling everyone here. All my companions have answered. Even my darling Vinnie believes she loves and trusts him. And I am standing alone in rebellion." There's a feeling of betrayal here by God, specifically Jesus here. Very prickly topics for 1850. Okay? So this is a woman who is unafraid to experiment and express herself. Here's the part, the technical nuts and bolts I would like you to understand. Usually, Emily Dickinson's poems are very, very short. They have regular meter and beat. They're not very confusing when you just look at them. She also uses near rhymes. We call them slant rhymes also. And those are rhymes that not quite rhyme. They do not quite rhyme. For example, orange and door hinge. All right. Imagery, they're they're stuffed with images. Now, unconventional punctuation. We will discuss this a little bit more later. In Emily Dickinson's poetry, the dash can mean anything, okay? It can represent any form of punctuation. Now, this causes the poetry to really open up and flower. You'll see. And they often deal with the following: God, death, and nature. Sometimes they're very funny too. These are some of her most famous poems, but we will read them. Here's the dash. All of her poems use this dash, and it was criticized. People thought it was silly or even unskilled. However, this is one of her trademarks now. And as I said, it can stand for any punctuation. And this makes the poetry, which is already ambiguous, even more unclear, okay? In her life, she only published a handful of her poems. She wrote nearly 1,800 poems, as you can see. She only published a handful of them in her lifetime. Oh, here's the other picture of Dickinson. Yeah, she says, "I am never lonely," right? She says, "I have hills, sundown, and a dog as large as myself." We think she died from complications of hypertension and kidney disease at age 55. Large poetic body left behind. Not much information behind that. So let's get started. Let's just jump right in. I told you Emily Dickinson's poetry oftentimes focuses on death. Here, death is personified. If you review your figurative language properly, you know there are metaphors, simile, those are the two most popular, I mean. Personification. If you look at the word personification, the word person is in the word. So death is somewhat like her boyfriend here, if you can imagine. All right. Because I could not stop for death, dash. Now remember, these are just one interpretation of this is just one interpretation of her poetry. I have pulled this from study, my professors, lots of research, and teaching the material for 15 years. However, they are still open to interpretation because of these curious dashes. Okay, is this a comma? Is it a question mark? Is it merely a pause? I'll start. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held just ourselves and immortality. Let's play with it. Well, first I have to put on my glasses. Okay. Death here is capitalized. Another trademark of her poetry. Odd capitalization. So death here stops for her, and she uses the word kindly. But why? If you consider death to be kind, then perhaps you are depressed. Perhaps you are feeling melancholy. Okay? The carriage held just ourselves and immortality. So she actually becomes encapsulated in this carriage of life and death. And like the sun, it moves across. Okay? We slowly drove. He knew no haste. Haste means to hurry. Death is in no hurry because death operates outside of time. We slowly drove. He knew no haste. And I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. So for his civility, okay? But these slant rhymes, do you see how she forces it to work with, says, knew no haste, away to civility, okay? She creates a rhyme where there is not one usually. But so what? Oftentimes we do not plan for death if it comes, when it comes. And here, she's occupying her life with labor and leisure too. She admits she has fun, but he was polite to stop for her. The poem gets a little bit darker. Inside of the death personification, she still uses metaphors and simile. We passed the school where children strove at recess in a ring. We passed the fields of grazing grain. We passed the setting sun. The poems become decidedly darker here. In America, children play a game. They actually don't play it anymore. It was banned in schools. Why? Too dangerous. We played when I was young, and you would get in a large circle. Everyone holds hands. Could this be the circle of life Emily Dickinson is talking about? We passed a school. Dickinson here is with death in the carriage, going through life's changes, going through the different phases of life. And here we are at the beginning, aptly with childhood. Okay? What does the ring represent? Possibly the circle of life. What is the point of this game? The point of this game is to get in the middle of the circle. So there's a circle with all your buddies, right? They're all holding hands in a big circle. And your job is to run into them as hard as you can to break the circle. No wonder it was banned, right? Anyway, we pass fields of grazing grain. Grain, I've mentioned this with Walt Whitman before, but grain can represent the brevity of life. What is Malone talking about now? Brevity of life, the shortness of life, the quick nature of life. We pass the setting sun. Sun, S-U-N, that could remind us of S-O-N, sun. And considering she had a preoccupation with religion, it seems like, could this be Jesus? Could sun be S-O-N, son, and represent Jesus? However, this has a darker tone. It says the sun passed over her. Was she forgotten? Did God forget her? What is this called? There's a term for it based in Old Latin poetry, dies abscondinas. And translated in Latin, it means the hidden God, the absconded God. Emily Dickinson assumably believed in God. However, it seems like she doubted sometimes that he was there. Sometimes she doubts that she will join him. Okay? Let's continue. Or rather, he passed us. He is capitalized. If you go to Sunday school, you know the Bible capitalizes Jesus with H. Okay? He is the Savior according to the Bible. The dews drew quivering and chill. For only gossamer my gown, my tippet only told. What? Now we start to change. The atmosphere almost metamorphosizes in front of us. When the sun passes over us, could this be a metaphor for Jesus passing over us? After the metaphorical sun or Jesus or life passes over us, we're left in the dark. Now she's on the other side of death, it looks like. It creates this strange mental effect where you see the sun going past you and you stand there in darkness. And who's there with you? Our boyfriend, Death. By the way, what is gossamer? Gossamer is a very thin fabric. That is a cartoon character. Here it is. God, yes, not the cartoon character. This is gossamer, okay? And it's very thin. Could this be her burial gown? Yes, absolutely. But the poem's not that simple. Might this be a wedding dress also? Perhaps. So Dickinson has created this weird life, death, lover, husband, destruction metaphor, and it is wonderful. Tippet. See, it's a piece of clothing. And a tulle. Oh, she's wearing a scarf because it's cold outside. When you venture into death, wear a coat. Tulle is the top of a, I'm sorry. More fabric. We paused before a house, capital H, that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice and the ground. Looks like we've come to the graveyard. The house is possibly her tomb. It even could be the underworld, some professors believe. Swelling of the ground. When I think of a ground swelling, it reminds me of a pregnancy. Again, another theme, evoking another theme. Death to life, life to death, okay? Womb, tomb. One thing I want to point out, if Emily Dickinson's poetry interests you, always wait until the end. Most of Emily Dickinson's poems have a turn at the end where things become much more strange. Since then, 'tis centuries and yet feel shorter than the day. I felt surmise the horses' heads were towards eternity. So eternity. Day, te, slant rhyme again. Why do this? Slant rhymes open up the possibilities, the words you can use, and the images you can create. And it also creates a sense of uneasiness. Why? She's venturing, possibly, into hell with death, her new boyfriend, perhaps. Unsettling feelings. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. She's been there centuries, it seems like, but it does not seem very long. And says that she realized the horses' heads. Could these be the horses of the apocalypse? The 4 horses of the apocalypse towards eternity. So it looks like she's going to be here forever. Conscious, not alive, but in a space between death and life. Very interesting. Like I said, she wrote 1,800 poems. However, none of them had any names. So when you refer to Emily Dickinson's poetry, we usually refer to it as the first line of her poem. You will see a number next to it. They came in 2 large notebooks that were tied together. And her sister published them after promising she would throw them away. Very, very happy betrayal for readers and fans of poetry, right? Simple one. After that heavy, depressing poem, let's have a few light ones. In this short life, capital L, that only lasts an hour, how much, how little is within our power? Seems to say, life is what you make of it. Geoffrey Chaucer, recycling an old Latin term, said, the art is long, life is short. Ars longa, brevitas vita. I forgot. We'll have to edit that out. Yes. So, in other words, do not waste your life. Life can be very, very long and boring, and you can accomplish nothing, or life can be effective, productive, and beautiful. The possibilities lie only within you. Interesting note. I feel you saying to yourself, this is only 2 lines, Mr. Evan. This is not a poem. But that's why the poem is so interesting. It's experimental. Emily Dickinson is claiming that life has infinite possibilities. Emily Dickinson is claiming that life will allow you to be useless. Much like this poem. A poem of only 2 lines may be limited. However, a poem of only 2 lines may be unfinished, right? Unfinished in a sense that it can go anywhere. Optimistic. Let's go to another fun one. Hope is the thing with feathers. Now here, Dickinson is very clear. She just doesn't say bird. I shouldn't say very clear. She is intentionally unclear. And because of that, it opens up her poem even more. A thing with feathers? We know that's a bird. But in poetry, plain words will not do. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings a tune without the words and never stops at all. So hope is your little soul bird, right? And where does it live? In your soul, okay? And what does it do? It sings, it inspires you, it motivates you. It should come as no surprise that the human spirit is often represented by a bird. Even in Christianity, the Holy Spirit appears sometimes as a bird, okay? Jesus appears as a pelican, piercing his own breast to feed his followers, okay? The sweetest in the Gale. Now we're talking about the bird or the song, okay? The sweetest song, the sweetest bird in the Gale. Gale? That's a strong, strong wind. Storm. Perhaps you have heard the phrase, storms of life. Oftentimes our troubles and struggles appear as wind or rain metaphors, okay? And the sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could have bashed the little bird that kept so many warm. In other words, the only storm that could hurt our little soul bird is a very bad one. A storm is life, however. So only the worst storms of life could bash our little soul bird, right? This is a person becoming so defeated and unmotivated that they cannot move forward. The storms of life. Could this be a death? Could this be more lost love? All conjecture. Maybe Gale is someone she knew. I doubt that. It says, I've heard it in the chilliest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity and ask a crumb of me. Two meanings here. You're a bird of inspiration, never ask for anything in return, even when you were experiencing the worst struggles of life, the chilliest land, strangest sea. Life and its troubles often appear as a port, a disturbed harbor, okay? Lots of rain disturbing on the boat. However, the other meaning could imply that it asks a crumb of me. In other words, if you want to achieve your goals, you must do something about it. You must feed the bird, right? You must feed your inspiration, your creativity, your motivation. Because mere motivation is a person without motivation is essentially useless, right? And that could be the message here. So it's inspirational, but maybe a warning also. She does place E. She capitalizes the E in extremity. Could this be for emphasis? Some people think that the capitalized letters perhaps spell a name. I think that's a poor way to read literature. I think that's the incorrect way to read a poem. But what do I know? How about another depressing one? I heard a fly buzz when I died. Hey, let's take a moment to look at what's going on up here in the chat room. Hey, there's Brandon. What else is going on here? Brandon asked a question already. Let's answer it for him. Will you think every cross you have seen is Jesus Christ? Let's see here. Will you think every cross you have seen exists? I'm not quite sure what you're asking here, Brandon. Do me a favor and reform that. It's very early in the morning. What I'm thinking you're asking here is, let's see. I'm not quite sure, Brandon. Re-ask this question if you're listening still. I'm still going to give you a thumbs up. All right. I heard a fly buzz when I died. The stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air between the heaves of storm. The speaker, I want to be clear. The speaker is the speaker. You would not say Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson is not the speaker. She is the poet. The narrator of your favorite movie is not the director of your favorite movie? Probably. The stillness in the room. The speaker here is dying, and there's quiet in the room. Why? Death is creeping in. But it also could be the respectfulness of the people in the room. Between the heaves of storm, heaving could be pulling, but it also could be, deep breaths. When do you have deep breaths? When you cry. Crying, rain, storms. Do you see the connection? Emily Dickinson's poetry is full of free associations. Some people think that makes them difficult to read. They're correct, but it also makes the poem special. The eyes around had wrung them dry. The eyes? She's crying. She describes her eyes as like a rag you've wrung out. However, what is really going on here? The eyes could be the ego. E-G-O, ego. I am, if you translate it into Latin. So the eyes could be wrung out from crying, but crying could also wring out her ego. She is dying. The self is going away, right? The breaths were gathering firm, becoming difficult to breathe. For that last onset, and the king be witnessed in the room. Is this a lover? Is this God? What is this? She's preparing for death. That's the king. Okay. So it's a very melancholy scene, a very almost depressing scene. I willed my keepsakes signed away. What portion of me be assignable? And then it was there imposed a fly. On her deathbed, the character seems to be thinking. What is she thinking about? She willed her keepsakes. Will is an interesting word in the English language because it has several different definitions. Your will to live could be your inspiration to go forward, your motivation to move forward with your life, to accomplish things. But a will is also a document you write before you die. So when you die, it determines who gets all your stuff. She wrote a will. But then she says something strange. What portion of me be assignable? She signed away everything that she could. However, there are parts, metaphysical, abstract parts of a human's personality that we cannot give away. They are one of a kind. So the narrator here is contemplating life and death as she is dying, and then a fly pops in, and she notices this fly. Okay. If you are in a poem or a play or a movie, and this happens, that is bad news, because flies are usually associated with death and the departure of the soul. Okay. With blue, uncertain, stumbling, buzz. I love that. I think that's my favorite Emily Dickinson line. Why? Because it's so descriptive. She refers to the fly as buzz, or she's referring to the buzz itself. Okay. And you can, because flies oftentimes do this when they navigate around your house, right? They fly like in little lines like this. Okay. So she calls it uncertain stumbling buzz. It's also the uncertain stumbling that we do during our lives. We stumble uncertainly through our entire existence, okay? Between light and me. So now the fly is flying between her and the window, right? And windows can be symbols of femininity, escape, and they also can be symbols of life and death, right? And then the windows failed. Her windows, her eyes. And then I could not see to see. This is the great turn I was telling you about earlier in class. This great turn becomes very strange. Dickens, or I should say the narrator, seems to be left behind in a space that is not life and that is not death. Could this represent her doubt of the afterlife? Or just the seemingly meaninglessness of death? Okay? So the fly here, she focuses on it for a brief second, and then the window is associated with the eyes closed. So the window no longer works because her eyes no longer work, right? That's how the window failed. But it's also the windows of her eyes fail, okay? Another uplifting poem by Emily Dickinson. I don't feel like reading this one right now. Let's pick up something a little bit nicer. Here we go, something really nice. The mushroom is the elf of plants. This is a little whimsical, right? A little bit cheerful, a little bit happy. I feel like some of you are saying, mushrooms are not plants. You're correct. But remember, Emily Dickinson was writing poetry in the 1850s. We have to cut her a little bit of slack, right? The mushroom is the elf of plants. At evening, it is not at morning, in a truffled hat. It is spot upon a spot. It is stop upon a spot. So it's like a little button that pops out of the ground every morning. As if it tarried always, and yet its whole career is shorter than a snake's delay and fleeter than a tear. So a mushroom, his whole life is very short. A tear is a little weed. Okay? Mushrooms only last 1, maybe 2 days, and they shrivel up. So they're like these little magical elves that pop up every morning and go away every night. And Emily Dickinson seems to be implying that there is an element of magic to the mushroom, right? 'Tis vegetation's juggler, the germ of alibi, doth like a bubble antedate, like a bubble high. So it seems to appear, mushrooms seem to appear like bubbles, and then they disappear. Every morning they appear like little bubbles and disappear. This certainly adds a spiritual element to the poem. It certainly adds a whimsical note, as I said at the beginning, but it certainly creates a magical tone, right? I feel as if the grass was pleased to have it interment, this superstitious scion of summer's circumspect. Now that's just fun to read, right? Look at all these S's. Surreptitious, scion, summer's circumspect. Why is it circumspect? Well, the mushroom pops up and kind of looks around, right? He has a round cap on his head and he can see all the way around, right? Had nature any supple face, or could she one condemn? Had nature an apostate, that mushroom, it is him. I told you all of her poetries had a strange, most of her poems have a strange turn. Apostate? This is a person who denounces their religion. Interesting choice of words. Apostate. Had nature an apostate, that mushroom, it is him. Some mushrooms are indeed poisonous. Some mushrooms will cause other problems for you. Other mushrooms are tasty. Don't ever eat mushrooms you find. Why? This is that poison she's talking about. Maybe this apostate. The idea that the mushroom is lovely and beautiful, almost like an elf, but it has a negative side too. Okay? It is that rejection, because a mushroom, nature requires mushrooms to break down rotten decay. Okay? So she presents this mushroom as almost this agent of death, right? But she capitalizes it. Him. Could this poem be a larger religious life and death cycle nature mushroom poem? Perhaps. Remember what I said about the dashes? They could stand for any form of punctuation. This can be very, very confusing. Good poem. Uh-oh. Let's see. We have time for a few more. And then I want to show you, excuse me, I want to work on composing a sentence that you can write with. Why won't this go away? There it is. I'm nobody. Who are you? I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell. They'll advertise, you know. How dreary to be somebody. How public, like a frog. To tell one's name, the livelong June, to an admiring bog. Emily Dickinson seems to reject fame and fortune for solitude, because in solitude, look at this, then there's a pair of us. Don't tell, they'll advertise. She seems to value her privacy and value being alone. Okay? Because those who have achieved stardom oftentimes are judged. Every move they make is judged and they're talked about. To tell how public, like a frog. So she compares famous people to this burping frog in a swamp, okay? And who is listening to the burping frog? A bog. A disgusting mud hole filled with insects. See? Who is the audience? A bog. It seems like Emily Dickinson is criticizing the public, doesn't she? You're correct. Yes. Oh, I also like June. If you've ever been to a bog or a swamp in the summer, especially in the American South, the frogs are so numerous and so loud, sometimes you can't even hear yourself talk. I'm not joking. The frogs are so loud and sonorous, you can't even think. So it's the mindlessness of the croaking celebrity to the mud hole. Emily Dickinson makes a good case for being alone in solidarity, doesn't she? Well, I think it's time we take a shift. If we have any more time, I'll go back to a few more poems. But let's talk for a moment about how to form a sentence, how to form a thesis sentence based on this material. I realize that often China is a test-oriented system. In China, they have a test-oriented school system. And much like the United States, if you want to succeed, sooner or later, you must write a successful, efficient, well-written essay. Okay? How do you start? I like I like to start by saying, if you are writing a synthesis essay, that is mixing elements from several resources to create a thesis, it must be broad enough to express on an essay, but narrow enough to explore and present your new ideas. How can we do this? Emily Dickinsons. Because oftentimes, as you get older, the teacher, your professor, will never give you a prompt. You must come up with your own. But don't let that scare you. That should be freeing, because now you can write about whatever you want instead of whatever nonsense your teacher wants you to spill out. Okay? Emily Dickinson's poetry contains several interesting, I have these fat fingers, I can't type, contains interesting, let's say interesting, contains interesting examples of punctuation and figurative language. Now, before we have our webinars, I never think about what I'm going to write at the end of class. I let it take a natural course. Why am I telling you this? Because I want you to see my brain struggle through the process. I think it's important. Writers are often afraid. What are you afraid of? You're afraid of being wrong. Well, if you're going to be wrong before you submit it to your teacher. Work it out in your head beforehand. And that can be difficult. So if your teacher gives you time before, always use it. Emily Dickinson's poetry contains several interesting examples of punctuation and figurative language. Good. Now, for example, in a fly buzzed, and I could not stop for death. Dickinson presents death as presents death as what? What is something that she does in, now I'm only using two examples here to be simpler. You can, however, use more. What is something that she discusses in both poems that uses interesting punctuation and strange figurative language? She presents death as what? A force, presents death as a calming force at the end of one's life, right? And how does she do this? Well, if you were to write this essay, you would start pulling examples from the poetry. Remember when she said, the heaving stopped, the stumbling buzz? These create nice flowing words, okay? Emily Dickinson presents death as a calming force at the end of one's life, okay? And then you move on from here, you make the shift to your body paragraphs, okay? All right. I got about 10 more minutes left, and I think we have time for questions. How should I go about this, Kay? Let's see here. Any questions so far? Brandon, cool.
Hi, Evan.
Hey, buddy.
Long time no see, and I would like to ask a question about Emily Dickinson that you have talked about today. And you have said that she expressed a lot of depressions, feeling and unhappy feeling that results to her life. And I would like to ask why she was expressing those opinion and why.
Good question, Brandon. Good questions. So here's the truth. We don't know. We essentially have 2 or 3 notebooks that were tied together in her lifetime, and her sister promised to destroy them. I believe it was her sister. And she did not. Only a handful of poetry was published in her lifetime. Other than that, we almost know nothing about her life. But I think that's what makes it more interesting. You see, I think that art can stand alone. I don't have to know about a director to appreciate his movie, right?
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to make. So I think while we don't know much about her personal life, and it does add an element of mystery and even surprise, but I don't think it's bad in this case because it certainly opens up her poetry to your interpretation, right?
Yeah.
That was a long answer. Good question, Brandon.
Thanks.
Cool. Let's look at one more little poem. Let's see. No. Let's look at Wild Nights. Wild nights. Where I with thee, wild nights should be our luxury. So here Emily Dickinson could be looking for the experience of life. Nighttime is special. It's a time of mystery and strangeness, okay? Futile the winds, to a heart in a port, done with the compass, done with the chart. Chart, pert. See how this slant rhymes, okay? Seems like these wild nights are actually passion and they calm her, right? The winds don't bother her. She's in a safe port in a nice city. And she's so safe, she describes it as Eden. If you don't know Hebrew, Hebrew is Eden for paradise. Rowing in Eden, the sea. Might I moor tonight in thee? She says, I will. So she compares this love, maybe this lover, this situation to being paradise on earth. So instead of being a terrible, scary harbor, it's a calm, loving harbor. Even with the wind, it is stable and strong. Why is this important? That's what we want, right? We all want stability and love. Perfect. I think that's a good end to our little lesson today. All right. Last chance for questions.
Okay.
All right. Well, I appreciate Ivy for letting me talk about poetry again, and I appreciate Kay, and thank you so much, everyone, okay?